The mechanical scream of a tungsten carbide drill bit biting into hardened steel produces a distinct, unforgiving pitch. It echoed through the shadowed oak-paneled study of the historic Massachusetts estate, cutting through the dense silence of the property. The air in the room carried the heavy, settled scent of aged paper and lemon floor wax, now mingling with the sharp, metallic tang of ozone and heated brass. I stood perfectly still, monitoring the vault technician progress. My posture remained rigid, my hands resting comfortably at my sides. Operating as a cybersecurity incident commander in Boston, my professional reality revolves around executing precise digital breaches and neutralizing internal threats. A century-old floor safe bolted to the foundation of my late grandfather home was simply another encrypted container awaiting a sanctioned extraction. The sudden crash of the heavy mahogany double doors slamming against the interior walls severed the acoustic rhythm of the drill. My older brother Marcus strode across the threshold. He radiated a frantic, unearned entitlement. His tailored suit jacket pulled tight across his shoulders as he closed the distance between the doorway and the desk. He did not ask what was happening. He did not inquire about the technician. He demanded an immediate halt to the operation, projecting the artificial authority of a man who believed he owned the very floorboards beneath our feet. He stopped 3 feet from the safe, raising his right hand, his fingers clamped around a heavy, antique brass skeleton key. He waved the metal instrument in the air, a physical prop intended to assert his dominance over the room and the grandfather lucrative inheritance. "You have no authority here," Gianna Marcus stated, his voice tight and breathless from his sprint across the estate grounds. "I control the access to this property. Tell him to pack up his tools and get out of my house." I did not flinch. I did not instruct the licensed technician to power down the drill. Confrontation lacking leverage yields zero return on investment. I stepped forward, closing the remaining gap between us, and bypassed the ornate brass keyhole entirely. "You only control the decoy, Marcus," I replied, my tone flat, clinical, and devoid of defensive heat. I reached beneath the steel rim of the casing, locating the flush, hidden digital interface my grandfather had integrated into the antique structure long before his passing. I inputted the 16-digit cipher securely transmitted to my encrypted server days before his death. The dual authentication protocol processed the data and accepted the sequence. A crisp electronic chime pierced the tension. The primary tumbler clicked, rendering the brass key in my brother's fist utterly useless. Marcus froze, his arm dropping to his side. The heavy iron door groaned, swinging outward on its reinforced hinges to expose the dark interior. Instead of velvet boxes containing heirloom jewelry or vintage bearer bonds, a thick, meticulously indexed dossier tumbled from the top shelf, striking the hardwood floor with a sharp slap. Beside it rested a formalized, signed document bearing a stark blue signature. I leaned down and retrieved the paperwork. It was a federal proffer agreement. I read the attached Federal Bureau of Investigation contact card aloud, my voice smooth and unhurried. The primary target listed in the sworn testimony was Marcus James. The color drained from my brother's face, leaving a pale, sickly ash as the realization of our grandfather's year-long deception crashed over him. The venture capitalist facade he spent years curating shattered in real time under the weight of institutional verification. Welcome back to Pan of Vengeance, where we sit in the dark with the secrets families try to bury, then turn on the lights to reveal the truth. I am Gianna James. I am 34 years old. Drop your age in the comments below so I know who is listening tonight, and be sure to subscribe. My brother believed he could lock me out of my own legacy. He failed to realize that an incident commander never initiates a breach without already possessing the decryption key. My operational environment in Boston requires a pristine lack of ambiguity. I sit in a climate-controlled security operations center located on the 42nd floor of a commercial high-rise overlooking the harbor. The ambient temperature remains fixed at 68 degrees to ensure the optimal performance of the server racks humming in the adjacent corridors. The air always smells faintly of ozone and sanitized synthetic carpet. My professional mandate as a cybersecurity incident commander involves monitoring the digital perimeters of a global technology firm. I spend my shifts identifying unauthorized access attempts, tracking hostile intrusions, and executing rigorous forensic data audits to neutralize threats before they compromise our proprietary network. I do not deal in assumptions or emotional narratives. I deal in verified digital footprints. Every morning, I reach into my structured leather tote and retrieve a specialized hardware device. It is a matte black encrypted authentication token attached to a woven nylon lanyard. I insert the metal connector into my workstation terminal and tap the smooth touch sensor, activating a secure cryptographic sequence. That simple physical action grants me administrative oversight over millions of sensitive data points. It is a profound level of control built entirely on the principle of zero trust. We verify every user, every device, and every transaction. I realized long ago that the most effective way to survive my own bloodline was to apply this exact threat assessment methodology to the people who shared my surname. My older brother Marcus operated as the most severe vulnerability within our family network. At 38 years old, he pursued a manufactured, affluent venture capitalist lifestyle he could not sustain. He possessed a staggering talent for projecting wealth, while simultaneously generating profound, unmanageable debt. He navigated the affluent circles of New England, masquerading as an elite investor, securing seed capital for startup companies that rarely materialized beyond a glossy presentation deck. I tracked his public performance through the superficial, highly filtered imagery he uploaded to his social media platforms. The photographs were meticulously staged, designed to project a specific aristocratic aesthetic. One recurring image featured Marcus standing on the teak deck of a leased catamaran off the coast of Nantucket. He wore crisp white linen trousers and a vintage diving watch, holding a flute of imported champagne against the backdrop of a flawless golden hour sunset. The visual data communicated a life of effortless leisure and permanent financial victory. The actual ledger, however, told a fundamentally different story. Marcus was a hollow structure. He bounced between leased luxury vehicles and overpriced downtown lofts, leaving a trail of delinquent invoices and broken contracts in his wake. His entire existence relied upon a steady, continuous influx of external capital to prevent the illusion from fracturing. The primary source of that illicit funding was our mother, Elaine. Elaine functioned as the ultimate enabler within the James family ecosystem. She viewed Marcus not as a flawed adult requiring accountability, but as a misunderstood genius perpetually victimized by bad timing and uncooperative business partners. She willingly blinded herself to his reckless behavior, choosing instead to subsidize his vanity to protect her own maternal pride. She could not stomach the social embarrassment of her golden child facing a public default. However, Elaine lacked the personal liquid assets to cover his escalating operational deficits. She lived on a fixed income, navigating her own modest budget. To bridge the gap between her resources and his demands, she turned her attention toward my stability. She began treating my corporate salary and my rigorous financial discipline as a communal safety net. The extractions always initiated with a carefully rehearsed phone call. My smartphone would illuminate on my desk, displaying her contact name. When I answered, the connection her voice would carry a specific manufactured fragility. She would describe a minor clerical oversight regarding Marcus and his vehicular lease, or a temporary cash flow hiccup threatening his membership at a local racket club. She never asked me to pay his debts directly. She framed the requests as temporary, short-term loans to help our family through a brief rough patch. She utilized guilt and obligation to bypass my logical defenses, implying that my refusal to assist would directly cause our mother severe physiological stress. I absorbed the burden. I transferred the requested funds, neutralizing the immediate crisis, to prevent the friction from spreading throughout the entire family grid. I paid the overdue balances and secured his pristine facade. My competence became my own worst enemy. When an analyst silently patches every vulnerability without demanding systemic reform, the client assumes the protective services require zero effort. My administrative labor was entirely invisible until it transitioned into a baseline expectation. I became the designated shock absorber, expected to cushion the impact of every reckless decision Marcus made. The only individual within our shared genetic circle who recognized this toxic parasitic dynamic was our grandfather Henry. He resided in a historic, sprawling estate on Cape Cod, isolated from the daily suburban noise generated by Elaine and Marcus. Henry operated as a retired municipal judge, decades spent presiding over contentious civil disputes and evaluating conflicting testimonies granted him a profound, unsentimental understanding of human nature. He did not evaluate people based on their curated aesthetics or their charming promises. He evaluated them based on the hard, verifiable evidence of their actions. Henry and I shared a quiet, unspoken alliance, rooted in our mutual reliance on logic. During the summer months, I would drive down the coast to visit his estate. We spent countless hours sitting in his shadowed, oak-paneled study, avoiding the chaotic family gatherings occurring on the back lawn. The room always carried the rich, comforting scent of cherry Cavendish pipe tobacco and old leather bindings. Our primary method of communication centered around a scarred wooden chessboard, resting on a small table near the window. The carved wooden pieces were heavy and worn, the varnished finish dulled by years of strategic maneuvering. Henry did not play the game to achieve a swift, effortless victory. He played to dismantle my assumptions and expose the flaws in my tactical planning. He taught me how to read the board beyond the immediate threat. During one particular match, I aggressively advanced my pieces, attempting to dominate the center squares. I believed controlling the middle of the board guaranteed my success. Henry sat back in his leather armchair, observing my hasty deployment. He did not counter my advance directly. He quietly maneuvered his knights and bishops along the periphery, building an inescapable snare. When he finally sprung the trap, capturing my queen in a devastating crossfire, he delivered the foundational lesson that would later dictate my entire operational strategy against my brother. Let an arrogant opponent think they control the center of the board. Henry stated his voice a low, gravelly rumble. Let them occupy the space. Let them feel invincible, right until the exact moment you take the king. He understood that Marcus was a terminal liability. Henry saw past the linen suits in the Nantucket yacht photos, recognizing his grandson as a hollow, opportunistic predator. He knew my brother viewed the family legacy not as a heritage to protect, but as a reservoir to be drained. Henry also recognized that attempting to confront Marcus or Elaine directly would only result in endless circular arguments and manufactured victimhood. He knew the situation required a far more permanent, structured resolution. When Henry passed away 18 months later, the fragile peace holding our family together instantly evaporated. The sudden absence of the patriarch removed the final authoritative barrier keeping Marcus in check. The mourning period had barely commenced before my brother shifted his focus from projecting grief to securing territory. He viewed the historic Cape Cod estate not as a place of memory, but as a premier asset awaiting extraction. The timeline of his greed accelerated with terrifying velocity. He did not wait for the formal reading of the will or the appointment of a legal executor. He moved to assert physical dominance over the property, assuming his status as the eldest male heir granted him unilateral control. He believed he could dictate the terms of the transition simply by occupying the center of the board. He was about to test the perimeter of the estate and I was preparing to initiate my own silent observation protocol to map his precise vulnerabilities. The Atlantic wind whipping off Nantucket Sound carried a bitter coastal chill that stripped the remaining autumn leaves from the oak trees lining the coastal highway. It was exactly 7 days since Grandpa Henry passed away. The formal memorial service remained unorganized, delayed by my mother Elaine and her sudden insistence on securing the perfect floral arrangements to impress her sprawling social circle. My objective for the afternoon was purely logistical and required zero emotional performance. Henry had laid out explicit legal instructions regarding his burial attire, requesting a specific navy worsted wool suit stored in the cedar closet of his primary bedroom. I navigated my vehicle down the long gravel driveway of the Cape Cod estate. The tires crunched methodically against the crushed stone, providing a steady, rhythmic acoustic baseline. The property stood quiet, a sprawling Victorian structure overlooking the gray, churning water of the bay. I parked near the detached garage, zipped my tailored wool coat against the biting air, and walked toward the side entrance. The heavy wooden door featured a modern digital keypad, an upgrade Henry allowed me to install 3 years prior to streamline access for his rotating staff of medical caretakers. I reached out my fingers, numb from the dropping temperature, and inputted my designated 6-digit authorization sequence. The mechanism did not produce the familiar, satisfying mechanical click of a retracting deadbolt. Instead, a harsh descending beep pierced the quiet afternoon. A red indicator light flashed twice across the black plastic interface. Access denied. I paused, analyzing the auditory and visual data. A commercial-grade digital lock does not spontaneously forget a programmed credential. A system failure of this specific nature requires manual human intervention. Someone had deliberately accessed the administrative console and purged my profile from the network registry. Before I could initiate a secondary diagnostic attempt, the heavy door swung inward. Marcus stood in the threshold. He did not project the demeanor of a man mourning the recent loss of a family patriarch. He wore a crisp, ironed cashmere sweater and expensive leather loafers, projecting the curated aesthetic of a wealthy inheritor taking immediate possession of his new domain. The coastal light caught the smug, sharp angle of his jaw. He looked down at me, his posture intentionally blocking the entryway, creating a physical barrier to match the digital one he had just engineered. "Gianna," he stated, his tone dripping with a patronizing, rehearsed calm, "I am glad you are here. I meant to call you regarding the updated security protocols." I maintained direct eye contact, keeping my facial expression entirely neutral. "You purged my credentials from the local system," I replied, stating the verified fact without an interrogative inflection. "It is standard procedure during a probate transition," Marcus countered, crossing his arms over his chest to project unearned authority. "I am the eldest. It falls on me to secure the assets. We cannot have people wandering in and out of the house while the estate inventory is being cataloged. It is a severe liability." The hypocrisy was staggering, yet mathematically predictable. He framed his hostile territorial takeover as a noble act of administrative diligence. Footsteps sounded on the hardwood floor behind him. Elaine materialized in the hallway, clutching a steaming ceramic mug of herbal tea. "Marcus is right, darling," my mother chimed in, deploying her signature enabling defense. "There are highly valuable items in this house. We must protect your grandfather's legacy from unnecessary interference. Just step back and let your brother manage the transition. He knows exactly what he is doing." I stood on the freezing porch, processing the dual-layered obstruction. Marcus was not securing the perimeter to protect the property from external thieves. He was locking the doors to isolate the environment from internal oversight. In my profession as a cybersecurity incident commander, a sudden, unilateral lockdown initiated by a secondary user always indicates a localized cover-up. When a rogue employee changes the server passwords, they are attempting to obscure an existing vulnerability before the corporate auditors arrive to inspect the ledger. Marcus was hiding something structural inside the architecture of Henry Financial Life. He needed me blind and locked outside the perimeter. A novice facing this blatant disrespect would demand immediate entry. They would raise their voice, cite their familial rights, and engage in a bitter shouting match on the frosted concrete. I recognize that engaging in an emotional dispute with an arrogant adversary and his dedicated enabler yields zero tactical advantage. Confrontation without leverage is a waste of oxygen. Arguing would only validate their perceived authority and signal that their exclusionary tactics were effective. I offered a single curt nod. "I understand your position," I stated, turning my back on the doorway. I walked down the wooden steps, ignoring the bewildered silence stretching behind me. I did not ask for the burial suit. I did not request a temporary access code. I simply returned to my dark sedan, pulling the heavy door shut to sever the interaction. The interior of the vehicle provided a silent, isolated operational theater. The freezing wind whipped across the windshield, but the cabin remained an insulated vacuum. I reached into the passenger seat and retrieved my encrypted workstation. I rested the aluminum chassis on my lap and lifted the screen. The glowing terminal interface cast a pale blue illumination across the dark leather interior. Marcus believed he had successfully secured the perimeter because he understood the physical reality of a locked door. He possessed zero comprehension of the digital infrastructure governing the estate. When I installed the smart home network, I structured the architecture to ensure seamless remote management. A system is only as secure as its foundational code, and I wrote the code. I engaged my diagnostic software, bridging a secure, encrypted connection to the local wireless network blanketing the property. The diagnostic tool probed the digital perimeter, identifying the central hub controlling the door locks, the interior cameras, and the climate systems. Marcus had utilized the primary wall-mounted console in the kitchen to revoke my access, assuming the physical interface granted him ultimate dominion. He failed to secure the backdoor administrative protocols I embedded deep within the root directory. My fingers moved across the keyboard with rapid, precise keystrokes. I bypassed the superficial user interface, tunneling directly into the system registry. The glowing terminal screen populated with lines of raw data detailing the access logs from the past 48 hours. I located the exact timestamp where Marcus executed the command to delete my profile. I isolated his newly created master administrator account. I did not delete his profile or lock him out of the network in retaliation. Alerting a hostile entity to a breach prompts them to upgrade their defenses. A cybersecurity expert knows the most potent weapon is invisible oversight. You grant the adversary the illusion of a secure perimeter while retaining the master key. I recalled the quiet chess matches in the study with Henry. Let an arrogant opponent think they control the center of the board right until you take the king. I initiated a specialized cloning sequence. I copied his encrypted credentials, mirroring his exact access permissions directly onto my own device. The software processed the request, the terminal screen flashing a green confirmation text indicating a successful deployment. I now possess the ability to unlock any door, monitor any camera, and review any digital log generated within the Cape Cod estate, all without triggering a single security alert on his end. Marcus stood inside the historic house drinking expensive scotch and congratulating himself on his strategic brilliance. He believed he had successfully exiled the incident commander. He was entirely unaware that he had just handed me unrestricted, invisible surveillance over his entire operation. I powered down the laptop and engaged the engine of the sedan. The immediate physical boundary was neutralized. Now I needed to identify the exact vulnerability he was so desperate to obscure. To predict a predator trajectory, you must follow their financial footprint. The shadow audit was officially online. To predict the trajectory of a hostile entity, an incident commander must detach from the emotional noise and follow the data trail. The drive from the freezing coastal winds of Cape Cod back to my secure workspace in Boston provided the necessary vacuum to process the physical lockout. Marcus believed changing a digital keypad granted him sovereign authority over our grandfather legacy. He failed to comprehend that physical barriers are merely superficial deterrents. The true architecture of a person's life resides in their digital footprint, and those footprints are permanently archived in ledgers he lacked the clearance to erase. I arrived at my high-rise apartment as the evening sky turned a bruised indigo. I bypassed the living area and entered my dedicated home office. The environment is optimized for deep forensic analysis. A wall of insulated glass blocks the ambient sounds of the city traffic below. A localized server tower hums steadily in the corner, regulating the temperature and maintaining the encrypted network I utilize for corporate threat assessment. I placed my ceramic mug on the edge of the desk. I took a sip. The bitter taste of cold, dark roast coffee washed over my palate, providing a sharp, grounding sensation. I swallowed the dark liquid, letting the caffeine sharpen my cognitive focus. I engaged my primary workstation monitors. The rhythmic clicking of my mouse echoed in the quiet room as I navigated past my standard corporate dashboards. I opened a sterile, secure browser. I needed to conduct a shadow audit of Henry Estate. My grandfather Henry operated as a municipal judge for over 3 decades. He was a man defined by rigorous order and unyielding discipline. He approached his personal finances with the exact same structural rigidity he applied to his courtroom dockets. He did not engage in speculative investments. He did not utilize volatile offshore accounts. He maintained a pristine, conservative portfolio consisting of blue-chip stocks, municipal bonds, and stable mutual funds. An individual possessing that specific psychological profile does not suddenly initiate erratic, high-volume transfers in the final year of their life. His established baseline was immaculate. Therefore, any deviation from that baseline would render itself as a glaring mathematical anomaly. A standard citizen might wait for a probate attorney to produce a sanitized summary of an estate. A cybersecurity professional knows that municipal databases and early probate filings are accessible if you possess the correct search parameters and the patience to sift through the raw code. I initiated a targeted query across the state registry and the financial tracking portals connected to Henry public tax identifiers. The spinning loading icon rotated for a fraction of a second before the initial datasets populated my screen. I stripped away the formatting and isolated the transactional logs for the previous 12 months. I focused my attention on the final 8 months leading up to his death. The anomaly surfaced within 10 minutes. It was not a subtle accounting discrepancy. It was a staggering systemic bleed. The stark black ink on the digitized municipal property filings and banking summaries glared against the white background of my monitor. Over the course of those specific 8 months, a sequence of substantial liquidations had occurred. Someone had systematically dismantled Henry Conservative mutual funds, selling off the assets and transferring the cash into a secondary holding account. I highlighted the extracted sums and ran a quick tabulation. The total equaled $400,000. $400,000 drained from the secure accounts of an elderly retired judge facing his final days. I leaned back in my ergonomic chair, the quiet hum of the server tower filling the silence. I needed to trace the destination coordinates. In the realm of elder care, sudden liquidations often point to specialized medical facilities, palliative care providers, or emergency surgical interventions. I required the routing numbers to verify the nature of the expenditures. I executed a secondary trace, tracking the outbound wire transfers. The digital pathway did not lead to a recognized healthcare network. It did not point to an established hospice organization or a licensed team of in-home medical professionals. The routing numbers pointed directly to a corporate holding company operating under the name Apex Vanguard Solutions. I opened a new tab and queried the state corporate registry. I requested the foundational filing documents for Apex Vanguard Solutions. The system retrieved the data. The registered agent and primary operating officer listed on the Articles of Incorporation was Marcus James. The pieces of the fragmented puzzle snapped together, forming a flawless, horrifying picture of predatory extraction. The holding company was a subsidiary shell registered under my brother's failing venture capital firm. Marcus had not spent the last 8 months comforting our grandfather or managing his transition out of public life. He had spent the final year of Henry's life quietly siphoning $400,000 of liquid capital to prop up his own bankrupt commercial endeavors. The motive for his sudden, aggressive territorial control at the Cape Cod estate crystallized with chilling clarity. Marcus changing the security codes and locking me out of the historic house was not an act of administrative diligence. It was an act of profound logistical terror. He knew the formal probate process mandated a comprehensive institutional audit of Henry assets. When a man possessing a pristine, lifelong financial record suddenly loses $400,000 to a shell company owned by his grandson right before his death, the court flags the transaction. The state designates it as severe elder financial abuse. Marcus was operating under a ticking clock. He needed to dictate the probate narrative before an independent fiduciary reviewed the ledgers. If Marcus controlled the physical property and the access to Henry private files, he could manufacture a defensive narrative. He could draft a fraudulent ledger or produce coerced documentation claiming the extracted capital was an authorized early inheritance. He needed to classify the stolen funds as a willing gift before the authorities froze his accounts and initiated a federal wire fraud investigation. He required me to remain blind-locked on the porch and isolated from the truth. The dynamic within the James family underwent a terminal shift. This was no longer a toxic sibling dispute over favoritism or the allocation of minor heirlooms. This was not a disagreement regarding the proper tone of a memorial service. This was a prosecutable federal crime. My brother was an active embezzler who had preyed upon the patriarch of our family. Elaine, my mother, was currently enabling a felon treating his hostile lockdown of the estate as a sign of his mature leadership. She was subsidizing his illusion, ignoring the rot beneath the floorboards to protect her own fragile vanity. I categorized the threat level, assigning it the highest possible security designation. I did not pick up my smartphone to call my mother and scream the truth into the receiver. Warning an adversary that you have breached their financial perimeter allows them to destroy the remaining physical evidence and secure legal counsel. It grants them the opportunity to construct a new layer of deception. I needed the final piece of the architecture. A digital footprint provides the mechanism of the theft, but physical documentation provides the undeniable intent. Grandpa Henry was a meticulous record keeper. A retired judge does not allow $400,000 to vanish without documenting the transaction. If Marcus had coerced him, or if Marcus had stolen the funds outright, Henry would have left a paper trail summarizing the breach. I knew exactly where Henry secured his most sensitive directives, the century-old steel floor safe bolted to the foundation of the study. It was a heavy, unyielding container that Marcus could not easily hack or drill without specialized equipment. The family was scheduled to conduct a supervised walkthrough of the estate the following week to catalog the visible heirlooms and initiate the estate inventory. Marcus would be forced to grant me temporary physical access to the interior of the house to maintain his facade of cooperative administration. He would expect me to focus on photograph albums and antique silverware. He would assume his secret was secure as long as I remained distracted by sentimental artifacts. He was unaware that the incident commander had already mapped his corrupted network. I took another sip of the bitter coffee. The shadow audit was complete. The reconnaissance phase was terminated. The upcoming walkthrough would serve as the optimal environment to test his defenses and identify the exact location of the most damaging physical evidence. The formal inventory of the estate commenced on a crisp Tuesday morning. The Massachusetts coastal air carried a sharp, freezing bite that penetrated the fabric of my tailored wool coat as I stepped out of my vehicle. The sky presented a pale, cloudless expanse, offering bright but sterile sunlight that illuminated the sprawling Victorian structure. My objective for the day required physical proximity to my brother and my mother. We were mandated to conduct a supervised walkthrough of the property, a standard probate procedure designed to catalog valuable heirlooms, assess tangible assets, and establish a preliminary ledger for the legal transition. Elaine treated the administrative requirement as a personal shopping excursion. She moved through the ground floor of the residence carrying a silver clipboard, her attention captivated by delicate bone china teacups and tarnished serving trays. She assigned value based entirely on aesthetic presentation, murmuring soft sounds of approval whenever she encountered a piece of vintage porcelain she believed would elevate her own dining room. Marcus trailed closely behind her, projecting the curated aura of a wealthy venture capitalist surveying his newly acquired domain. He wore a tailored navy suit jacket paired with expensive dark denim, a calculated outfit engineered to communicate effortless success. He pointed toward various antique furniture pieces, dictating which mahogany sideboards and velvet armchairs would best complement the exposed brick walls of his leased downtown loft. He evaluated the legacy of a retired municipal judge through the shallow lens of an interior design catalog. I walked behind them, holding a digital tablet. I did not care about the porcelain plates or the decorative upholstery. I cared about the underlying financial ledger. My shadow audit had already uncovered a severe mathematical anomaly. I knew Marcus had siphoned $400,000 of Henry liquid capital into a fraudulent shell company in the months preceding his death. I understood that a retired judge possessing a pristine financial history would never authorize a transfer of that magnitude without generating a comprehensive paper trail. I needed to identify the exact location of the physical documentation Henry utilized to track his own accounts. The ground floor cataloging consumed 2 tedious hours. We finally bypassed the formal living areas and approached the heavy oak doors of the primary study. The environment inside this specific room differed drastically from the rest of the Victorian structure. It did not invite casual lounging. It was a space engineered for focused, solitary labor. Thick dust motes danced lazily in the shafts of pale sunlight filtering through the drawn velvet curtains. The air in the study carried the rich, settled scent of dried ink, old leather bindings, and hardened floor wax. It smelled like decades of quiet discipline. In the far corner of the room, bolted directly into the foundational concrete beneath the floorboards, sat the century-old steel floor safe. It was a formidable, heavy structure. The dark iron casing appeared cold and unyielding, absorbing the ambient light rather than reflecting it. The vault served as a perfect physical manifestation of Grandpa Henry and his strict, uncompromising morality. He did not bend to convenience. He did not yield to external pressure. He secured his truths behind heavy, impenetrable steel. I walked across the patterned rug, stopping a few feet from the dark metal box. I raised my digital tablet, preparing to generate a new entry field. "We need to itemize the contents of the internal vault," I stated, my voice level and professional, cutting through the quiet hum of the study. Henry kept his finalized directives and his primary financial ledgers secured in this specific unit. Marcus did not hesitate. He abandoned his appraisal of a nearby mahogany bookshelf and stepped directly into my path. He positioned his body squarely between me and the cold steel surface. He squared his shoulders, the fabric of his tailored jacket pulling tight across his chest. He projected the aggressive posture of a man defending his sovereign territory against an invading force. He reached into the front pocket of his trousers. His fingers emerged, holding a heavy, antique brass skeleton key. It was the primary physical access tool required to disengage the mechanical locks on the floor safe. He did not hand the instrument to me. He tossed it lightly into the air, catching the brass bow in his palm with a practiced, arrogant rhythm. "There is nothing in there you need to worry your little head about, Gianna," he stated. His tone dripped with a rehearsed, patronizing condescension. He offered a smug, artificial smile designed to diminish my standing in the room. "The estate attorneys will handle the complex financial paperwork. You should focus on helping Mom sort through the kitchenware." He paused, letting the brass key rest in his open hand, ensuring I recognized his physical possession of the access token. "You are acting incredibly self-important today," he continued, his voice hardening into a reprimand. "You need to stop treating our grandfather home like a pristine crime scene. It is disrespectful to his memory." He flipped his wrist, slipping the heavy brass instrument back into his pocket. The metal produced a dull, heavy clink as it settled against his thigh. Elaine stepped into the study, clutching her silver clipboard to her chest. She sighed, producing a long, theatrical sound of manufactured exhaustion. "Your brother is right, Gianna," my mother chimed in, rushing to establish a unified front with her golden child. "You are exhibiting a severe level of clinical paranoia. Marcus is simply streamlining the administrative process. Let him manage the heavy lifting. We do not need your corporate auditing skills right now." A novice facing this blatant gendered dismissal and public humiliation would react with immediate hostility. They would demand the brass key. They would cite their legal rights as a designated heir and force a bitter shouting match in the middle of the shadowed study. They would attempt to physically bypass the obstruction. I did not raise my volume. I did not step closer to his tailored suit or demand the return of the metal key. Confrontation lacking leverage is an inefficient use of cognitive energy. In the realm of cybersecurity, analyzing the defensive behavior of a hostile actor provides the exact blueprint of their vulnerabilities. When an adversary aggressively guards a specific physical node on a network, deploying insults and access denials to keep inspectors away, they are inadvertently broadcasting the exact location of their most damaging secrets. By stepping in front of the iron door and confiscating the manual access tool, Marcus confirmed my hypothesis. The safe did not contain mundane tax returns or outdated birth certificates. It contained the payload. It held the raw, unredacted proof of his $400,000 embezzlement. He was terrified of what I would uncover if that heavy steel door swung open. Furthermore, confiscating a physical key grants an adversary a profound, blinding complacency. Marcus believed he had successfully neutralized the incident commander. He assumed that controlling the brass instrument granted him sovereign authority over the truth. He failed to comprehend that a physical lock is merely a superficial deterrent, a decoy designed to occupy the attention of a linear thinker. He wanted to feel victorious. I decided to grant him the illusion of a flawless defense. I looked at the smug, sharp angle of his jaw. I looked at the thick dust motes swirling in the sunlight between us. I lowered my digital tablet, resting my hands comfortably at my sides. "Understood," I replied. My cadence remained smooth, clinical, and devoid of any defensive friction. "I will leave the contents of the safe to your discretion." Elaine released a breath, her rigid posture relaxing as she registered my apparent submission. Marcus offered a final triumphant smirk, turning his attention back toward the antique furniture. I turned my back on the cold, unyielding surface of the steel vault and walked out of the study. I allowed him to keep his metal prize. He thought he had won the skirmish, successfully exiling me to the margins of the estate transition. He was entirely unaware that his frantic desperation had just handed me the precise targeting coordinates for the next phase of my shadow audit. The physical walkthrough was no longer necessary. I needed to return to my secure workspace in Boston. Marcus was hiding a devastating financial secret, and I needed to leverage my professional capabilities to dig deep into the holding company he utilized to funnel Henry wealth. The intelligence gathering phase was accelerating, and the digital footprints waiting on my encrypted server were about to reveal a fraud far more complex than simple elder abuse. The transition from localized probate theft to interstate commercial fraud necessitates a shift in operational environment. The sprawling, dust-filled rooms of the Cape Cod estate provided the initial geographical context for the boundary violation. Now I required the sterile, encrypted vacuum of my Boston workspace. I drove back to the city, the coastal highway unspooling beneath my tires. The sky above transitioned from a crisp, pale blue to a bruised, heavy slate. The sharp smell of rain permeated the cabin of my vehicle, a preamble to the impending coastal squall. I arrived at my high-rise apartment and bypassed the living area, heading straight for my home office. The room is a dedicated security operations center. Insulated glass blocks the ambient noise of the urban traffic below, and a localized server tower hums steadily in the corner, regulating the temperature and maintaining the encrypted network I utilize for corporate threat assessment. I locked the door, engaged my dual-monitor workstation, and prepared to conduct a deep-dive forensic analysis of Marcus's financial architecture. A cybersecurity incident commander does not guess. We trace the code. We follow the digital exhaust. My previous municipal query had identified the primary destination of the extracted $400,000. The funds were routed to a holding company registered under Marcus's venture capital firm. Now I needed to dissect the internal plumbing of that specific corporate shell. I initiated a targeted search utilizing my specialized commercial databases. I bypassed standard consumer credit reports and drilled directly into the Uniform Commercial Code filings, the state corporate registries, and the international wire routing logs. The spinning loading icon rotated on my screen for 3 seconds before rendering the initial datasets. I stripped away the formatting and isolated the transactional history for Marcus's primary venture capital enterprise over the past 36 months. The pattern emerged with chilling clarity. Marcus was not operating a legitimate investment firm. He possessed 0 viable products, no functional intellectual property, and no legitimate revenue streams. He was operating a sophisticated Ponzi scheme. He utilized the incoming capital from new investors to pay the promised dividends to the early participants. It was a classic, unsustainable financial structure built entirely on the illusion of continuous growth. The $400,000 he siphoned from Henry's conservative mutual funds served a singular, desperate purpose. He injected our grandfather's retirement savings directly into the failing machinery to prevent a catastrophic default and mask the insolvency from his increasingly restless stakeholders. The scope of his deception was staggering. He was not merely an entitled heir, he was a prolific, calculating fraudster. However, a glaring anomaly within the data suddenly arrested my analysis. I leaned closer to the monitor. I focused my attention on the specific transaction identification numbers attached to the final 2 transfers Henry made before his passing. The initial extractions followed a predictable pattern, moving from Henry's local checking account into Marcus's corporate ledger. But the final transfers, totaling nearly $200,000, originated from a vastly different source. They did not come from a standard retail banking institution. The routing data pointed toward a highly secure, restricted access account. I ran a secondary trace on the origin coordinates. The glowing green indicator on my screen illuminated the results, confirming the institutional source. The funds originated from a Federal Reserve account specifically designated for asset forfeiture and marked capital. I stopped typing. The steady, rhythmic clicking of my keyboard ceased, replaced by the low, mechanical hum of the server tower. A sudden, profound realization settled over the dark office, chilling the air far more effectively than the storm raging outside my window pane. A retired municipal judge does not accidentally access a federally restricted account. A man possessing a pristine conservative financial history for 8 decades does not mistakenly wire marked government funds to a fraudulent shell corporation. Henry was not a senile victim of elder abuse. He was not a confused patriarch blindly signing away his assets to a manipulative grandson. He was a retired judge who spent his entire career evaluating criminal intent and assembling prosecutable evidence. He recognized the rot within Marcus long before anyone else. He saw the Ponzi scheme. Grandpa Henry was actively baiting the trap. He intentionally transferred highly traceable, federally flagged funds into Marcus's unsecure account. By accepting that specific capital, Marcus elevated his localized financial mismanagement into a major federal crime. The transaction guaranteed that the Federal Bureau of Investigation possessed the undisputed jurisdiction to execute a wire fraud sting. Henry was operating as a confidential informant against his own flesh and blood. He utilized his final months to construct a watertight, inescapable legal snare, ensuring the Golden Child's predatory enterprise would be permanently dismantled. The implications of this discovery recontextualized the entire physical landscape of the Cape Cod estate. I recalled the heavy brass skeleton key Marcus had stolen during the walkthrough. I visualized the dark, unyielding surface of the century-old steel floor safe bolted to the foundation of the study. The safe did not contain outdated tax returns or sentimental heirlooms. It did not hold standard estate directives or the finalized versions of a simple will. It held the physical evidentiary deliverables. Henry had meticulously compiled the raw data, the recorded communications, the bank statements, the sworn affidavits, and locked them inside that vault for the designated field agents to retrieve. He built the entire case, secured the documentation, and then passed away, leaving the final execution of the audit unresolved. Marcus believed he had successfully locked me out of the estate. He believed confiscating the brass key granted him sovereign authority over the narrative. He thought he was guarding his stolen inheritance. He was entirely unaware that he was standing guard over his own federal indictment. He was babysitting the exact physical evidence required to send him to a federal penitentiary for the next 2 decades. I was no longer simply auditing a toxic sibling dispute over a stolen inheritance. I was stepping directly into the climax of a highly coordinated federal sting operation. The intelligence gathering phase was complete. The true nature of the battlefield was illuminated. I needed to formulate a strategy to bypass Marcus's physical obstruction and grant the authorities access to the vault. I needed to execute a flawless tactical breach, but I first had to manage the final desperate maneuvers of the enabler who was rapidly running out of time. A successful threat mitigation strategy requires constant vigilance, even after the primary vulnerability is identified. I remained seated in my Boston workspace, the ambient hum of the localized server tower providing a steady acoustic baseline against the rhythmic drumming of the coastal rain on the window pane. I possessed the undeniable knowledge of the federal sting operation. I understood that Grandpa Henry had deliberately routed flagged government funds into my brother's holding company, transforming a localized estate dispute into a prosecutable interstate felony. The iron safe contained the evidentiary deliverables, and Marcus was unwittingly standing guard over his own impending indictment. The intelligence gathering phase had yielded the ultimate leverage. However, a cybersecurity incident commander understands that a cornered adversary does not remain stagnant. When a hostile entity realizes they are operating under a ticking clock, they engage in lateral movement. They attempt to fortify their position by compromising secondary systems. Marcus could not alter the financial ledger, so he decided to alter the social narrative. He needed to construct a firewall of public opinion to insulate himself from the inevitable fallout. The initial indicator of his new offensive strategy arrived at 7:14 in the evening. A sharp, distinct notification chime pierced the quiet atmosphere of my office. It was a specific auditory alert I had assigned to my extended family contact group. I shifted my gaze from the encrypted financial routing logs on my primary monitor and unlocked my smartphone. The incoming transmission originated from cousin Olivia. She resided in the affluent suburbs of Cambridge and functioned as the primary distribution node for the James family gossip network. Information flowed toward her, and she routed it outward with a thin, polished veneer of manufactured concern. I opened the messaging application. The bright text illuminated the screen, presenting a masterclass in secondary manipulation engineered by my brother. Gianna, I am deeply troubled by the rumors circulating tonight. Olivia wrote her digital words, dripping with rehearsed performative sympathy. Marcus hosted a lovely dinner for the aunts this evening. He is carrying such a heavy burden, trying to manage Grandpa Henry's estate, and he shared the unfortunate news regarding your behavior. We are all so disappointed to hear you are contesting the will out of pure greed. I read the sequence of characters, my biometric indicators remaining perfectly stable. My pulse did not elevate. My hands did not tremble. I simply processed the data points, decoding the architecture of the smear campaign. The text message continued, detailing the specific vocabulary Marcus had implanted into the family ecosystem. Please stop acting so self-important, Gianna. Marcus is trying to protect the legacy, and your selfish demands for liquid capital are tearing the family apart. You need to drop your calculating opportunism and let your brother handle the transition smoothly. I visualized the scene unfolding 70 miles away. Marcus operated with a predictable, theatrical rhythm. He possessed a lifelong talent for curating optics. If he broke a neighbor's window during our childhood, he would stand on the front porch with a broom, convincing the homeowners that a sudden gust of wind caused the damage, and he was merely there to sweep up the glass. Tonight, he was applying that exact methodology to our extended relatives. He had invited the prominent aunts and influential cousins to a catered dinner. I could picture the dining room, the warm glow of the chandelier reflecting off the polished mahogany. I could hear the sharp, delicate clinking of crystal wine glasses as Marcus poured expensive vintages, utilizing the alcohol to soften their critical thinking. He stood at the head of the table, wearing a tailored suit, adopting the posture of an exhausted, grieving grandson. He lowered his voice to a theatrical, confidential whisper, pouring his fabricated grievances into their eager ears. He painted himself as the noble, subsidized heir, striving to preserve the family honor against the relentless attacks of a cold, calculating sister. He claimed I was a toxic opportunist, demanding unearned wealth and attempting to sabotage the probate process. The aunts nodded, their faces arranged into masks of condescending pity. They absorbed his false narrative wholesale. They murmured their support, offering their loyalty to the man they believed was suffering under my unyielding cruelty. The strategy possessed a crude, predictable logic. Marcus recognized that the upcoming estate inventory posed a severe risk to his venture capital facade. He needed to ensure that if I attempted to expose his financial discrepancies, my testimony would be preemptively discredited. By labeling me greedy and vindictive, he created a social buffer. If I brought forward the truth, the relatives would simply roll their eyes, attributing my factual disclosures to pure, unadulterated jealousy. He was poisoning the well to ensure no one would drink the water I offered. The staggering, dramatic irony saturating the environment was almost palpable. The extended Massachusetts relatives were currently sipping wine and pitying Marcus for enduring my supposed toxicity. They were validating his struggle and condemning my selfishness. They were entirely ignorant of the stark, verified arithmetic resting on my encrypted server. They did not know the grieving grandson standing before them was actively operating a fraudulent Ponzi scheme. They did not know he had siphoned $400,000 from a dying man to prop up his vanity projects. Most importantly, they were oblivious to the federal snare waiting to snap shut. They were cheering for a man who had stolen marked government funds, a man who was weeks away from facing a severe federal wire fraud indictment. The audience was praising the thief while throwing stones at the auditor. A novice encountering this level of character assassination would experience a surge of defensive rage. They would draft a furious multi-paragraph rebuttal to Cousin Olivia, attaching screenshots of the probate laws and demanding a formal retraction. They would drive to the family dinner, burst through the doors, and initiate a loud, chaotic defense in the middle of the dining room. A cybersecurity professional understands that defending yourself against a fabricated rumor only validates the underlying premise. Friction generates heat, and heat draws unwanted attention. Arguing with a proxy like Olivia only provides the adversary with the emotional friction they require to cast you as the unstable, uncooperative villain. I do not negotiate with corrupted nodes, and I do not participate in unverified theatrical performances. I tapped the digital keyboard, drafting a concise, neutral reply. I am currently dedicating my focus to my professional obligations. Olivia, I typed, I wish you and the family a pleasant evening. I pressed the send icon. The software processed the command. I watched the gray text bubble of my response slide upward on the screen, logging my unbothered acknowledgement. I pressed my thumb against the glass display and swiped left. The entire conversation thread vanished from my active inbox, transferring securely into the archive directory. I maintained my absolute silence. I allowed my brother to retain the final word in the social arena. Letting an adversary believe they hold the tactical advantage is the most efficient method of securing their eventual defeat. Marcus and his enabling audience were currently operating under a delusion of unassailable control. They believed my brief neutral response indicated a profound, crushing submission. They assumed I was sitting in my Boston apartment, weeping over my social exile, paralyzed by the weight of their collective disapproval. Their manufactured victory lowered their defensive perimeter. They stopped scanning the horizon for incoming threats. Marcus returned his focus to curating his affluent aesthetic, convinced he had successfully neutralized the incident commander. He believed he was building an untouchable pedestal of social dominance. I decided to let him construct it as high as his vanity permitted. The laws of physics dictate that an increase in elevation corresponds directly to an increase in potential energy. When a host of witnesses absorbs a false narrative, the eventual revelation of the truth yields a much higher kinetic impact. The taller the structure, the more devastating the inevitable collapse. Marcus was digging his own grave, and he was using expensive wine and sympathetic relatives as his shovels. The intelligence gathering phase was finalized, and the adversary was blind to his own exposure. The timeline was compressing rapidly. I needed to ensure Marcus dropped his guard entirely so I could bypass his physical blockade and initiate the final, undeniable breach of the steel floor safe. The situation required a deliberate engineered surrender to set the ultimate trap. The timeline governing my operational window began to compress with unforgiving speed. I required unfettered access to the historic Cape Cod estate to initiate a physical breach of the century-old floor safe. Marcus currently occupied the property. Like a sentinel, his paranoia fueled by the ongoing probate transition and the millions of dollars he had secretly siphoned from our grandfather. He monitored the security perimeter constantly. If I pulled a utility van into the driveway while his defensive radar remained active, he would summon local law enforcement to execute a trespassing arrest before the technician could even plug in the tungsten drill. To bypass a vigilant sentry, you do not launch a frontal assault. You deploy a diversionary tactic designed to confirm their preconceived biases. In cybersecurity architecture, we utilize honeypots. We construct a vulnerable fake server network and present it to the hostile actor. The intruder attacks the decoy, feeling triumphant as they breach the weak defenses, entirely oblivious to the fact that their true target remains hidden and their own digital footprint is being recorded. I needed to construct a psychological honeypot. I needed Marcus to drop his guard entirely. I had to convince him that I possessed zero tactical leverage and lacked the endurance to sustain a protracted legal conflict. I did not contact a premier Boston litigation firm. Retaining a high-tier attorney would signal strength and provoke Marcus to fortify his own legal representation. Instead, I conducted a regional search for a budget legal practitioner operating in the outer suburbs. I located a practitioner occupying a modest storefront situated between a discount dry cleaner and a defunct retail outlet. The attorney specialized in uncontested divorces and minor traffic infractions. He possessed a valid state bar number, which was the only credential I required for this specific deployment. I paid his minimal retainer fee and instructed him to draft a formal demand letter regarding the James family estate. I provided explicit parameters for the correspondence. I forbade him from citing any specific probate statutes or referencing the $400,000 holding company discrepancy. The letter needed to project desperate, hollow posturing. It demanded a fair consideration of the heirloom assets and requested a transparent accounting of the property, utilizing generic, uninspired legal phrasing. The attorney generated the document and dispatched it to Marcus via standard certified mail. I procured a digital copy for my own records. The presentation was remarkably weak. The correspondence was printed on cheap, generic letterhead, featuring a faded, low-resolution logo. The paper stock was thin, lacking the heavy, textured authority of a premium corporate firm. The font was a standard, unrefined serif. It looked exactly like the desperate, final effort of a woman who had exhausted her financial resources. Marcus evaluated the world exclusively through the lens of aesthetic wealth. He respected displays of immense capital and despised anything that hinted at a budget. When he opened that envelope and examined the cheap letterhead, his hubris would dictate his response. He would not see a calculated tactical maneuver. He would see a sister who could not even afford a competent lawyer. He would hand the weak demand to his own expensive retainer counsel, who would easily swat the generic claims away with a single condescending response brief. Marcus would laugh. He would feel a profound, intoxicating surge of superiority. He would conclude that I was out of my depth, flailing blindly against an opponent I could not match. But a weak legal letter merely establishes the premise of defeat. To finalize the illusion, I needed to deliver the formal surrender. I sat in my dark home office, the glow of the dual monitors casting a pale blue light across my hands. I opened my encrypted email client and initiated a new message addressing the communication to both Marcus and our mother, Elaine. The steady clicking of the keyboard provided a rhythmic acoustic bassline as I drafted the fake capitulation. I abandoned my standard precise syntax. I utilized phrasing designed to project deep emotional exhaustion. I wrote that the recent hostility within the family network was too draining to endure. I stated that I could no longer participate in the endless friction surrounding our grandfather's legacy. I typed the specific sentence they desperately wanted to read. I am stepping away from the probate process entirely. I ceded the role of primary executor to Marcus. I told them to handle the transition as they saw fit, requesting only that they cease contacting me regarding the administrative details. I reviewed the text, ensuring it conveyed the exact tone of a broken, defeated adversary abandoning the battlefield. I pressed the send icon. The digital swoosh of the outgoing email echoed in the quiet room. The response arrived with breathtaking speed. Marcus did not wait hours to consult with his legal team or discuss the development with Elaine. He replied within 4 minutes. The incoming notification chimed, and I opened the reply. It contained a single word, noted. The brevity of the message communicated volumes. It was smug, dismissive, and saturated with unearned triumph. He did not offer a false olive branch or a performative apology. He simply accepted my surrender, believing his character assassination campaign and his territorial lockout had successfully eradicated my presence from the estate timeline. This decoy communication functioned flawlessly. By granting him the illusion of absolute victory, I altered his operational behavior. When an arrogant predator believes the prey has vacated the territory, they stop patrolling the fences. They lower their defensive perimeter. They become critically sloppy. Marcus shifted his focus entirely away from my potential interference. He stopped monitoring the estate security logs. He stopped worrying about independent institutional audits. He directed his energy back toward curating his affluent venture capitalist aesthetic and planning the opulent memorial luncheon he intended to host at the country club. He believed he had won the war. He was entirely blind to the sophisticated cyber audit I was currently running across his network. Having granted the incident commander the clearance to move unseen, I tunneled deeper into the digital architecture of his fraudulent holding company. He handed me the keys to his back office, assuming I was weeping in Boston. I navigated the offshore routing numbers, tracking the flow of the stolen capital as it washed through the Ponzi scheme. I documented the specific accounts he utilized to pay his early investors, gathering the irrefutable evidence required to secure his federal indictment. The trap was holding steady. However, as I monitored the incoming digital traffic hitting his corporate domain, a sudden anomaly flagged on my secondary screen. It was not a localized access attempt or a routine banking query. It was a recurring sequence of encrypted packets originating from a highly restricted server block. I isolated the signal and ran a trace on the digital footprint. The origin point was not a commercial entity or a private wealth management firm. The IP address pinged directly back to a federal law enforcement database. My pulse maintained its steady rhythm, but a sudden chilling realization settled over the dark office. I was not the only entity auditing my brother's corrupted ledger. Someone else was already inside the network, and their presence fundamentally rewrote the entire history of our grandfather's final months. This decoy communication functioned flawlessly. By granting him the illusion of absolute victory, I altered his operational behavior. When an arrogant predator believes the prey has vacated the territory, they stop patrolling the fences. They lower their defensive perimeter. They become critically sloppy. Marcus shifted his focus entirely away from my potential interference. He stopped monitoring the estate security logs. He stopped worrying about independent institutional audits. He directed his energy back toward curating his affluent venture capitalist aesthetic and planning the opulent memorial luncheon he intended to host at the country club. He believed he had won the war. He was entirely blind to the sophisticated cyber audit I was currently running across his network. Having granted the incident commander the clearance to move unseen, I tunneled deeper into the digital architecture of his fraudulent holding company. He handed me the keys to his back office, assuming I was weeping in Boston. I navigated the offshore routing numbers, tracking the flow of the stolen capital as it washed through the Ponzi scheme. I documented the specific accounts he utilized to pay his early investors, gathering the irrefutable evidence required to secure his federal indictment. The trap was holding steady. However, the final phase of the deployment required one more piece of verifiable data. The federal footprint I discovered indicated that Grandpa Henry had purposefully lured Marcus into a trap, utilizing federally flagged funds to trigger jurisdiction. But Henry's plan was built on Marcus's greed. He couldn't have anticipated the lengths to which our mother would go to shield her golden child. Elaine was the wild card. She operated as the ultimate enabler, capable of immense, unpredictable rationalizations to protect Marcus's manufactured success. I needed to document the exact depth of her complicity. If the federal authorities were going to dismantle this operation, they needed to see the entire structural rot of the James family, not just the primary embezzler. The opportunity arrived 2 days before the scheduled estate clearing. I was sitting at my kitchen island in Boston, finalizing the operational timeline for the vault breach. The winter sun hung low in the sky, casting long, sharp shadows across the hardwood floor. The security intercom buzzed. It was a harsh, jarring sound that cut through the quiet hum of the refrigerator. I walked to the panel and checked the video feed. Elaine stood in the vestibule, clutching her designer purse, her posture radiating a manufactured, nervous energy. She had not called ahead. She had not requested permission to enter my perimeter. She arrived unannounced, assuming her maternal status granted her automatic, unyielding access. I buzzed her up, unlocking the primary security door. I did not intend to welcome her with tea or pleasantries. An incident commander does not host hostile entities. They interrogate them. Elaine stepped out of the elevator and walked down the short corridor. I opened the door before she could knock. She wore a tailored wool coat and expensive leather boots. She offered a tight, anxious smile, a facial expression engineered to project vulnerability while masking her true intent. "Gianna, darling," she said, her voice thin and reedy. "I know this is sudden, but we need to resolve a minor administrative detail before the probate court convenes." She stepped across the threshold, invading my safe space. I did not offer to take her coat. I stood my ground, maintaining a neutral, clinical posture. "State your business, Elaine," I replied, refusing to utilize familial endearments. She hesitated briefly, unsettled by the lack of friction. She expected me to be weeping over my recent surrender, a broken daughter desperate for maternal validation. Instead, she encountered a stone wall. She reached into her purse and retrieved a single folded sheet of paper. She smoothed the creases, her fingers trembling slightly, and held it out toward me. "Marcus found this document in Henry's desk," she claimed, her voice climbing an octave. "It clears up the confusion regarding the recent financial transfers." I took the paper. I did not need to read the dense, archaic legal boilerplate to understand its purpose. The document was a fabricated, backdated promissory note. It classified the stolen $400,000 not as an embezzlement, but as a legitimate, pre-death business loan authorized by Grandpa Henry to support Marcus's venture firm. My analytical brain processed the forgery in fractions of a second. Marcus had drafted this fiction to sanitize the ledger before the institutional auditors arrived. But a promissory note requires authentication. It requires a witness signature to validate the transaction in the eyes of the probate court. "Marcus needs you to sign this, Gianna," Elaine continued, her tone adopting a desperate, pleading frequency. "Just as a witness, it will make the estate transition so much smoother. It proves Henry wanted to help him." I looked down at the document. The signature line bearing Henry's name was a clumsy, inaccurate replica of his rigid, disciplined cursive. It was a forgery, executed by a man desperate to avoid a federal indictment. And my mother was standing in my apartment, demanding I become an active accessory to the crime. "You are asking me to witness a fabricated document, Elaine," I stated, my voice smooth and devoid of defensive heat. "You are asking me to legitimize a massive, prosecutable fraud." "It is not a fraud," she shrieked, the manufactured vulnerability instantly evaporating. "Your grandfather wanted Marcus to succeed. He knew the business was struggling. He helped him out. You are just trying to destroy your brother because you are jealous." She explicitly prioritized the golden child's fraud over the truth. She acknowledged the business was failing, tacitly confirming the Ponzi scheme, but she demanded I absorb the criminal liability to protect the family's social standing. She was willing to force me into committing a felony to shield Marcus from the consequences of his own greed. I did not argue with her. I did not raise my voice to point out the glaring logical fallacies in her defense. Confrontation without leverage yields zero return on investment. I simply held the forged document, letting her desperate, frantic words echo in the quiet apartment. A deep, resonant voice interrupted the silence. "The document is fraudulent, Elaine." Liam stepped out of the hallway leading to the home office. My partner, a quiet logistics coordinator, rarely engaged in the toxic dynamics of the James family. He operated as a steadfast, observant ally, providing tactical support and a grounded perspective. He understood the architecture of the operation, and he recognized the exact moment his presence was required. The peacemaker transitioned into the enforcer. He walked toward the entryway, his footsteps steady and unhurried. He stopped a few feet from Elaine, establishing a firm, physical barrier between her and me. He did not yell. He did not threaten her. He simply stood there, his presence radiating an unyielding, immovable authority. The rigid, squared set of his shoulders communicated a definitive boundary. "You are attempting to coerce Gianna into signing a forged legal instrument." Liam continued his tone, carrying the precise clinical cadence of a man neutralizing a threat. "You are operating as an accessory to embezzlement. The perimeter is closed." He reached out his hand, steady and gently, but firmly took the designer purse from her trembling grip. He handed it back to her, a clear physical directive to leave. Elaine stared at him, her mouth opening and closing without producing a sound. She was accustomed to manipulating me, to exploiting my ingrained habit of compliance. She was entirely unprepared to face a unified front, a solid wall of resistance that she could not guilt or bribe into submission. She took a frustrated step backward. The rubber sole of her expensive leather boot squeaked sharply against the hardwood floor. It was the auditory signature of a sudden, involuntary retreat. "You will regret this," she hissed, her voice a toxic, venomous whisper. "You are tearing this family apart." "The family tore itself apart years ago, Elaine," Liam replied smoothly. "We are simply refusing to sweep up the wreckage." He stepped forward, forcing her back across the threshold. He closed the heavy wooden door, the deadbolt engaging with a solid, satisfying click. The physical boundary was secured. The hostile entity was expelled. I stood in the entryway, holding the fabricated promissory note. I looked at the fraudulent signature, the clumsy, desperate attempt to rewrite history. I walked back into the home office and opened the sleek black presentation folder resting on my desk. I placed the forged document inside, resting it next to the printed offshore routing numbers, the shadow audit of the shell corporations, and the archived text messages detailing the smear campaign. The parental complicity was officially recorded. Elaine had handed me the final piece of the puzzle, the undeniable proof that she was an active, willing participant in the theft. The black folder was complete. The intelligence-gathering phase was terminated. The trap was fully armed, the evidence was collated, and the designated targets were eagerly accelerating toward the drop zone. The timeline was compressing rapidly. The country club memorial luncheon was scheduled for the following afternoon. Marcus was preparing to deliver a tearful, arrogant eulogy, convinced he had secured absolute dominion over the estate. He believed he was holding court. He had no idea the vault he thought he controlled was about to be breached, and the shadow ledger he tried to bury was about to be exposed to the blinding light of a federal investigation. The successful deployment of a tactical breach relies heavily on environmental control. You cannot execute a covert infiltration if the primary adversary is patrolling the perimeter. To guarantee the historic Cape Cod estate remained completely vacant, I needed to manipulate the schedule of the current occupant. I did not rely on complex subterfuge or elaborate misdirection. I relied entirely on Marcus's vanity. A narcissist requires an audience. Marcus possessed a profound, unyielding hunger for public validation, an insatiable need to perform his curated, affluent identity for the extended Massachusetts relatives. He viewed the recent passing of Grandpa Henry not as a tragic familial loss, but as a prime networking opportunity. To solidify his self-appointed status as the new patriarch of the James family, Marcus organized a lavish memorial luncheon. He selected the most exclusive country club on the Cape, a venue defined by strict membership requirements, manicured lawns, and an atmosphere dripping with old money aesthetics. He mandated the attendance of every aunt, uncle, and cousin, intending to use the catered event as his coronation. I received the formal embossed invitation in the mail. I drafted a polite, sterile response formally declining the event. I cited my previous email reiterating that the recent family hostility was too exhausting to endure, and I preferred to mourn our grandfather privately in Boston. Marcus accepted the refusal without hesitation. His hubris blinded him to the tactical implications of my absence. He assumed my decline signaled absolute surrender, confirming his belief that he had successfully bullied me into submission. He thought I was hiding in my apartment, paralyzed by the weight of his social dominance. He believed he had won the war, rendering him critically sloppy regarding his own defensive perimeter. The morning of the memorial luncheon arrived, bringing a crisp, overcast coastal sky. At precisely 11 o'clock, the operational window opened. Marcus was standing in the grand ballroom of the country club, 15 miles away from the estate. He was wearing a custom-tailored dark suit, clutching a crystal glass of expensive scotch, and soaking in the whispered admiration of the gathered relatives. I sat in the passenger seat of an unmarked white utility van. The vehicle idled quietly near the tree line, just out of sight of the main entrance to Henry's property. The driver was a licensed bonded vault technician I had contracted out of Providence, a man who asked 0 questions as long as his premium hourly rate was secured in escrow. I retrieved my encrypted smartphone, waking the terminal. I bypassed the standard applications, tunneling directly into the cloned administrative profile I had harvested weeks prior. The digital interface of the estate's smart home network populated my screen. Marcus believed he had locked me out of this system when he hastily changed the superficial user codes. He was entirely unaware that I held the master key, granting me unrestricted, invisible surveillance over his entire operation. I engaged the command protocol for the primary security gates. I did not utilize a physical keycard or punch a code into the external keypad. I simply tapped a green icon on my screen. The heavy wrought iron gates responded instantly. A seamless electronic chirp echoed through the damp coastal air, signaling the disengagement of the magnetic locks. The massive iron structures swung inward, gliding smoothly along their tracks, granting us unfettered access to the pristine gravel driveway. "Proceed," I instructed the technician, my voice calm and devoid of any adrenaline-fueled heat. He shifted the van into gear, the tires crunching methodically against the crushed stone. We rolled past the manicured hedges and the dormant rose bushes, navigating the long approach toward the Victorian structure. The estate stood silent and imposing, an architectural monument to Henry's strict, unyielding discipline. We bypassed the front entrance, steering the utility van toward the rear service driveway, parking discreetly behind the detached garage. The location provided optimal cover, shielding the vehicle from the sightlines of any passing neighbors or local delivery driver. I stepped out of the passenger side. The cold coastal wind bit at my face, carrying the sharp scent of salt water and decaying pine needles. The technician cut the engine, the sudden silence emphasizing the isolation of our environment. He opened the rear cargo doors, the metal hinges emitting a low, brief groan. He retrieved 2 heavy reinforced canvas bags containing his specialized equipment. The heavy thud of the van doors closing punctuated our arrival. The infiltration was underway. While we approached the rear service door of the mansion, Marcus was holding court in the country club ballroom. I could visualize the scene with perfect crystalline clarity. He was likely standing at a podium near the front of the room, preparing to deliver his rehearsed, tearful eulogy. He would speak of Henry's profound legacy, utilizing the moment to elevate his own status. He would claim that Grandpa Henry entrusted his entire empire to him, painting himself as the noble, designated heir responsible for guiding the family into the future. The extended relatives would nod in solemn agreement, entirely ignorant of the stark, verified arithmetic resting in my black presentation folder. The dramatic irony saturating the timeline was absolute. The audience at the country club was praising a man who had embezzled $400,000 from the very grandfather he was eulogizing. They were cheering for an active fraudster who was utilizing stolen capital to fund his venture capitalist facade. And Marcus, drunk on the validation of his peers, believed he controlled the narrative. He thought he was guarding his stolen inheritance. He was completely oblivious to the fact that the grandfather he was eulogizing had actually orchestrated a massive federal sting, utilizing federally flagged funds to build a watertight indictment against him. Most importantly, Marcus believed the century-old steel floor, bolted to the foundation of the study, was secure. He believed confiscating the brass skeleton key granted him sovereign authority over the evidence. He had no idea the vault he thought he controlled was currently under siege. I bypassed the digital keypad on the rear service door, utilizing the cloned credentials to electronically retract the deadbolt. The heavy timber swung inward, granting us access to the mudroom. I deactivated the internal security sensors, neutralizing the alarms before they could register our presence. The interior of the house was quiet, the air stale and smelling faintly of lemon polish and old wood. I guided the technician through the kitchen, navigating the familiar hallways until we reached the heavy oak doors of the primary study. The room remained exactly as I remembered it during the supervised walkthrough. Thick dust motes danced lazily in the pale light filtering through the velvet curtains. The environment projected an aura of deep historical permanence. In the far corner, bolted directly into the concrete foundation, sat the target. The century-old steel floor safe. That is the objective, I stated, gesturing toward the dark, unyielding metal box. The technician set his heavy canvas bags onto the patterned rug. He knelt beside the vault, extracting a high-powered flashlight to examine the brass faceplate and the mechanical dial. He evaluated the density of the steel casing, calculating the specific tungsten carbide bits required to breach the outer shell. "This is an antique," he noted, his voice low and professional. "Solid iron construction. The internal tumblers are likely complex. It will take time to drill through the primary layer." "You have a pristine 2-hour operational window," I replied, my tone clinical and precise. "The primary occupant is currently delivering a speech 15 miles away. Proceed with the extraction." The technician nodded, pulling a heavy-duty power drill from his bag. The operational phase was accelerating. The physical barrier protecting the federal evidence was about to be dismantled. However, a successful breach relies on an environment free of external disruptions, and a residential neighborhood is rarely an isolated vacuum. The timeline was compressing, and an unanticipated variable was about to threaten the perimeter. The technician engaged the primary power source of his specialized equipment. The heavy-duty motor whirred to life, generating a low, resonant hum that vibrated through the thick floorboards of the historic study. He aligned the tungsten carbide bit against the exposed brass faceplate of the century-old steel vault. He applied a steady, unyielding forward pressure. The resulting mechanical friction produced a distinct, unforgiving pitch. It was a sustained, high-frequency scream that echoed through the shadowed, oak-paneled room, cutting efficiently through the dense silence of the Cape Cod property. The rapid rotation of the industrial bit against the hardened iron generated a swift increase in localized temperature. The ambient air in the study grew heavy, carrying the settled, comforting scent of aged paper and lemon floor wax, now mingling directly with the sharp, acrid metallic tang of ozone and heated brass. I stood perfectly still, monitoring his progress from a distance of 4 feet. My posture remained rigid, my hands resting comfortably at my sides. Operating as a cybersecurity incident commander, my professional reality revolves around executing precise digital breaches and neutralizing complex internal threats. A floor safe bolted to the concrete foundation of my late grandfather home was simply another encrypted container awaiting a sanctioned extraction. I regulated my breathing, keeping my heart rate at a steady resting pace. A flawless operational window requires the total absence of external monitoring. We had secured the digital perimeter by cloning the administrative credentials, and we had successfully bypassed the physical locks on the rear service entrance. We parked the unmarked utility van discreetly out of direct sight from the primary coastal highway. However, residential neighborhoods function as highly efficient, decentralized surveillance grids. They possess human nodes operating with unpredictable behavioral patterns, acting as an uncalibrated analog alarm system. A local neighbor acting as an unauthorized sentry noticed the presence of the foreign vehicle parked near the rear driveway. She processed the visual anomaly. Recognizing that the designated heir of the estate was currently hosting a publicized memorial luncheon, she perceived the utility van as a localized threat to the property. She retrieved her cellular device and transmitted a direct text message to the individual she believed held sovereign authority over the residence. I could visualize the exact sequence unfolding 15 miles away inside the opulent ballroom of the exclusive country club. Marcus was likely standing near the front podium, gripping the polished edges of the wooden lectern. He was undoubtedly delivering his rehearsed, tearful eulogy. He was spinning a fabricated narrative, claiming our grandfather entrusted his entire legacy and his sprawling financial empire solely to him. He was soaking in the whispered admiration of the extended Massachusetts relatives, basking in the unearned validation of his peers. He believed he was holding court, solidifying his status as the new, undisputed patriarch of the James family. Then, the sharp, distinct beep of an incoming text message interrupted his theatrical performance. He checked the illuminated screen. The brief string of text dismantled his curated reality in a fraction of a second. The neighbor informed him of the unknown contractors breaching his secured territory. The notification punctured his vanity, replacing his smug satisfaction with profound, paralyzing paranoia. He knew the true contents of the vault. He understood the severe legal and financial devastation awaiting him if an independent auditor breached that specific steel casing and retrieved the hidden ledger. He abandoned the podium. He offered zero logical explanation to the bewildered guests and the confused catering staff holding trays of expensive appetizers. He sprinted toward the country club valet stand, demanding the keys to his imported sedan. He navigated the winding coastal roads back to the estate at reckless, unsafe speeds, driven by the sheer terror of losing his stolen capital. He believed he could still intercept the threat and preserve his fraudulent venture capitalist facade. Inside the study, the technician maintained his steady forward pressure. The structural integrity of the outer casing began to yield under the relentless friction. Small, curled shavings of bright, hot metal accumulated on the intricate patterns of the vintage rug beneath the vault door. The operational timeline compressed rapidly, drawing the disparate elements of the conflict into a singular, focused point of convergence. I did not check my watch. I did not pace the length of the room. I simply waited for the inevitable arrival of the hostile entity. The heavy mahogany double doors did not open with a gentle push. They crashed inward, slamming harshly against the interior paneled walls. The physical impact severed the acoustic rhythm of the drill, echoing like a discharged firearm across the quiet hallways of the house. Marcus strode across the threshold. He radiated a frantic, unearned entitlement. His custom-tailored suit jacket pulled tight across his shoulders as he closed the distance between the doorway and the heavy mahogany desk. His chest heaved, drawing in ragged, shallow breaths from his desperate sprint across the estate grounds. His eyes were wide and manic, darting rapidly between the kneeling technician and my unmoving, stoic posture. He did not ask what was happening. He did not inquire about the identity or the purpose of the licensed vendor operating the machinery. He demanded an immediate halt to the operation, projecting the artificial authority of a man who believed he owned the very floorboards beneath our feet. He expected me to shrink under his sudden, volatile presence. He assumed his raised volume and his physical proximity would trigger a submissive retreat. He stopped 3 feet from the safe, raising his right hand. His fingers clamped tightly around a heavy, antique, brass skeleton key. He waved the metal instrument in the cold air. It was the exact same key he had confiscated during our supervised walkthrough weeks prior. He wielded it as a physical prop intended to assert his dominance over the room, and the lucrative inheritance secured within the iron box. He believed that holding the manual access tool granted him sovereign immunity against any forensic inquiry. "You have no authority here," Gianna Marcus stated, his voice tight and breathless from his panic. "I control the access to this property. Tell him to pack up his tools and get out of my house." I did not flinch. I did not take a single step backward to widen the physical gap between us. I did not instruct the licensed technician to power down the drill or pack away his equipment. Confrontation lacking leverage yields zero return on investment. I looked at the flushed, frantic features of my older brother. He was a hostile entity, desperately attempting to patch a critical firewall breach using nothing but empty verbal threats and a useless piece of shaped brass. The environment was fully optimized. The external distractions were successfully mitigated by his own hasty departure from the luncheon. The audience of one was captive and entirely focused on the unfolding transaction. The shadow audit was primed and ready for formal presentation. The intelligence gathering phase had reached its absolute conclusion, leaving only the swift, definitive deployment of the verified data. The technician operating the high-speed power tool possessed the pragmatic instincts of an independent contractor who valued his premium hourly rate over engaging in unpredictable domestic disputes. When Marcus burst through the heavy mahogany doors, radiating frantic hostility, the technician wisely disengaged the primary motor. The sudden cessation of the tungsten carbide drill bit grinding against the hardened brass faceplate left a ringing void in the shadowed study. The high-frequency mechanical scream faded, replaced by the ragged, shallow breathing of my older brother. The air in the room remained thick, saturated with the sharp, acrid tang of heated metal and ozone mingling with the historical scents of dried ink and lemon floor wax. Marcus interpreted the technician stepping backward as a definitive surrender. He believed his elevated volume and his sudden physical intrusion had successfully re-established his territorial dominance over the estate. He positioned himself directly in front of the century-old floor safe, utilizing his tailored suit to physically shield the iron casing. His chest heaved from his reckless sprint across the manicured lawns. He raised his right arm, thrusting his closed fist toward the center of the room. Between his white-knuckled fingers, he held the antique brass skeleton key he had confiscated during our supervised walkthrough weeks prior. He waved the ornate metal instrument in the chilled air, treating it as a sovereign scepter. He believed that possessing the manual access tool granted him unquestionable authority over the vault and its contents. He assumed the heavy brass object insulated him from any forensic inquiry. He expected me to shrink back to apologize for the breach and to retreat to my vehicle in profound disgrace. A threat actor relying on elevated volume and physical posturing is a threat actor who has exhausted their strategic options. In the realm of cybersecurity, we evaluate an adversary based on their technological sophistication. Marcus was attempting to secure a corrupted network using analog methods. He was a linear thinker operating in a digital theater. I did not take a step backward. I did not instruct the licensed technician to pack his canvas equipment bags. I kept my posture immaculate, keeping my spine straight and my shoulders squared. I looked at the flushed, panicked features of the man who had spent the last 18 months siphoning $400,000 from a dying patriarch. "You only control the decoy, Marcus," I stated. My voice did not echo, but it carried with clinical, surgical precision, cutting through the breathless silence of the study. The words lacked any defensive friction. They were delivered with the flat, unyielding cadence of an incident commander notifying a rogue employee that their network privileges have been permanently revoked. The statement caused a visible disruption in his cognitive processing. His brow furrowed, and the arrogant, sharp angle of his jaw slackened slightly. He looked at the brass key in his hand and then back at my face, struggling to reconcile my calm demeanor with the reality of the breached perimeter. I did not wait for his brain to catch up to the current timeline. I stepped forward, closing the remaining physical distance between us. I did not ask for his permission to approach the vault. I did not attempt to pry the heavy brass instrument from his trembling grip. I simply walked past him, invading the personal space he had just aggressively attempted to claim. He froze, entirely disoriented by my lack of compliance. He had prepared for a bitter shouting match. He had prepared to leverage his status as the eldest male heir to force my submission. He did not anticipate a frictionless bypass. I crouched beside the cold, dark surface of the steel safe. The iron casing retained a faint, localized warmth generated by the friction of the drill bit, radiating a subtle thermal signature into the drafty room. I ignored the primary brass keyhole. It was a fabricated target, an engineered distraction designed specifically to occupy the attention of arrogant thieves and lazy auditors. Grandpa Henry was a retired municipal judge who spent decades evaluating human nature through the lens of verifiable facts and prosecutable evidence. He understood that my brother possessed a predatory, opportunistic pathology. Henry knew Marcus would attempt to seize control of the estate the moment the central authority figure vanished. Therefore, Henry did not rely on a single point of failure to secure his most damaging intelligence. He engineered a dual authentication protocol. He left the brass skeleton key in a semi-obvious location, knowing Marcus would inevitably locate it, steal it, and guard it with his life. The physical key was a psychological honeypot. It granted Marcus the illusion of absolute control, breeding a profound, blinding complacency that ensured he would never inspect the perimeter for a secondary mechanism. While Marcus spent weeks guarding the decoy Henry had quietly handed the actual decryption tool to the auditor. I ran my fingertips along the lower rim of the heavy steel casing. Beneath a thin, stylized ridge of iron molding, my tactile search located a smooth, flush surface. It was a hidden digital interface seamlessly integrated into the antique structure, entirely invisible to an untrained observer. I recalled the encrypted transmission I received exactly 3 days prior to my grandfather passing. The message arrived via a secure, decentralized communication channel we utilized for highly sensitive exchanges. The text contained 0 exposition and 0 emotional sentiment. It contained only a 16-digit alphanumeric cipher. I pressed my index finger against the hidden panel. The interface awakened, emitting a faint, localized blue glow that illuminated the dusty floorboards. I inputted the sequence. My keystrokes were rapid, deliberate, and unhesitating. Each digital entry represented a calculated maneuver, a chess piece sliding into a terminal position. Marcus watched me, his mouth opening and closing without producing a sound. He could not comprehend the technology I was manipulating. His curated venture capitalist aesthetic did not prepare him to counter a localized cyber breach. The 16th digit registered on the touchpad. The dual authentication protocol processed the encrypted data instantly, verifying the cipher against the internal secure registry. A crisp electronic beep pierced the heavy atmosphere of the study. It was a sharp, synthetic sound, signifying a verified credential and an authorized entry. Deep within the thick iron door, the final internal tumbler clicked. It was not the dull scraping sound of a brass key turning a mechanical lock. It was the precise, resonant snap of an electronic actuator disengaging the primary deadbolt. The mechanical failsafes retracted. The heavy steel door groaned, shifting outward on its reinforced hinges. The sound was a low, grinding protest of century-old metal surrendering its protective seal. The brass skeleton key dangled limply in my brother's hand. His fingers loosened their grip, the ornate metal suddenly heavy and entirely devoid of purpose. The primary leverage he believed he held had been rendered utterly useless. The physical prop he used to assert his dominance was nothing more than a historical artifact holding 0 currency in the current operational theater. The chess match was officially over. Marcus had spent the entire probate process attempting to control the center of the board. He changed the keypad codes, he isolated the estate, and he hoarded the physical keys. He occupied the space and declared himself the victor. He never realized that true strategy involves letting your opponent secure the superficial perimeter while you quietly, invisibly take the king. The heavy iron doors swung wide, exposing the dark, cavernous interior of the vault. The breathless silence in the study stretched thick and palpable, broken only by the ragged, panicked breathing of the golden child. The intelligence-gathering phase was officially terminated. The physical, evidentiary deliverables Grandpa Henry prepared were waiting in the shadows, and the receipt-dropping climax was ready for presentation. The heavy iron door of the century-old floor safe settled against its hinges with a final, resonant groan. The dark interior of the vault was illuminated only by the faint ambient light filtering through the drawn velvet curtains. The space did not contain the predictable trappings of generational wealth. I did not discover stacks of vintage bearer bonds, velvet jewelry boxes, or stacks of pristine currency. A retired municipal judge does not secure his legacy with easily liquidated assets. He secures his legacy with verified intelligence. I reached into the cold, cavernous space. My fingers brushed against the rigid spine of a heavy canvas-bound portfolio resting on the primary steel shelf. I gripped the thick binding and extracted the designated payload. I did not produce a pre-sealed evidence bag bearing an agency logo. The collection of raw data precedes formal packaging. I pulled the object into the ambient light. It was a meticulously indexed dossier functioning as a comprehensive shadow ledger. I did not toss the bound portfolio onto the floor or thrust it toward my brother in a display of emotional triumph. A compliance director manages the transfer of critical documentation with formal, deliberate precision. I walked past Marcus, keeping my posture immaculate, and placed the heavy canvas binder squarely onto the center of the polished mahogany desk. The physical impact produced a loud, definitive slap. It was the auditory signature of a finalized audit. Marcus remained frozen near the open vault, the useless brass skeleton key still gripped tightly in his pale, trembling fist. His chest heaved in shallow, frantic bursts, the panicked rhythm of a man who suddenly realized the ground beneath his feet was no longer solid. He watched me flip the heavy cover of the dossier open. The first document resting inside the portfolio was not a standard financial statement or a mundane tax return. It was a formalized legal instrument, printed on thick, premium stock paper. The header displayed the stark, unmistakable seal of the United States Department of Justice. It was a signed federal proffer agreement. I did not offer a preliminary summary or attempt to translate the legal boilerplate. An auditor allows the primary source documentation to speak for itself. I lifted the pristine sheet and began to read the sworn testimony aloud. My voice remained smooth, clinical, and entirely devoid of malice. I utilized the precise, unhurried cadence of a technician reading a fatal diagnostic report. I, Henry Winston James, being of sound mind and acting as a willing participant in the ongoing investigation, hereby submit this sworn affidavit. I read the words projecting cleanly across the shadowed study. The syllables cut through the stagnant, heavy air. The following documentation details a systemic pattern of elder financial abuse, illicit capital extraction, and coordinated wire fraud. The primary target of this investigation, and the individual responsible for the ongoing embezzlement, is my biological grandson, Marcus James. The breathless silence in the room intensified. The realization of our grandfather's massive year-long deception crashed over my brother with the kinetic force of a physical blow. The fabricated reality Marcus had spent months constructing the illusion of the benevolent patriarch, eagerly funding his venture capitalist lifestyle, shattered in real time. The grandfather he thought he was stealing from had not been a senile, confused victim of elder abuse. Henry had been an active, willing participant in a coordinated federal sting operation. He had intentionally transferred highly traceable federally flagged funds into Marcus Unsecure Holding Company, actively baiting his own grandson to commit a prosecutable felony. He had weaponized the theft to build a watertight, inescapable legal snare. The color drained entirely from Marcus' face, leaving his skin the color of wet ash. The arrogant, sharp angle of his jaw slackened. The polished venture capitalist facade dissolved, replacing his expensive tailoring with the posture of a cornered, terrified fraudster. He had believed he was outsmarting an old man. He failed to realize he was merely providing the rope for his own execution. I continued reading the document, ensuring every syllable of the federal agreement registered in the quiet room. The text detailed the specific dates and routing numbers of the $400,000 extraction. It outlined the mechanics of the Ponzi scheme Marcus utilized to launder the stolen capital. It verified the exact coordinates of the shell corporations he registered to hide the incoming funds. The dossier provided a flawless panoramic view of his criminal architecture. I reached the final paragraph of the proffer agreement. I read the concluding sentence detailing the transfer of all collected evidence to the designated federal authorities. I lowered the document. I did not return it to the canvas binder. I placed it face up on the mahogany desk, ensuring the bold blue ink of Henry's signature remained clearly visible. The signature was rigid, disciplined, and entirely uncompromising. It was the physical manifestation of a man who refused to allow a parasite to consume his legacy. I reached back into the black presentation folder resting in my leather tote bag. I retrieved a small rectangular piece of heavy cardstock. I dropped the object directly onto the signed affidavit. It was a business card. The embossed text displayed the name and contact information for the lead special agent assigned to the Financial Crimes Division of the Regional Federal Bureau. The deployment of the card served as the ultimate verification. The shadow ledger was not a theoretical threat or an empty legal exercise. It was the foundational component of an active, ongoing federal investigation. Marcus stared at the bold red and blue logo printed on the small card. The reality of institutional verification stripped away the last remaining layers of his delusion. He could not charm his way out of a federal indictment. He could not utilize our mother to subsidize a defense against the United States government. The safety net was permanently dissolved. The intelligence-gathering phase was complete. The evidentiary deliverables Grandpa Henry meticulously prepared were now a matter of public record. The localized probate dispute had officially transitioned into a catastrophic federal emergency. But the audit was not yet finalized. I possessed my own separate ledger detailing the specific boundary violations and cyber intrusions executed during the recent weeks. The final presentation of those specific liabilities was required to ensure the absolute permanent destruction of the hostile network. The printed business card resting atop the sworn affidavit represented the culmination of our grandfather's final years. It was the physical bridge connecting a private family betrayal to a public institutional reckoning. I observed the precise physiological toll this revelation exacted upon my brother. Marcus stood anchored to the vintage rug, his respiratory rate accelerating into a series of shallow, hyperventilating gasps. The tailored fabric of his expensive suit jacket rose and fell with an erratic, unpredictable rhythm. The brass skeleton key, the artifact he had wielded as a symbol of supreme territorial dominance, slipped from his numb fingers. The metal struck the hardwood floor with a dull, heavy clatter, rolling aimlessly into the shadows near the baseboards. He was a compromised entity, attempting to reboot a corrupted operating system. His brain struggled to process the verified data. He had spent his entire adult life relying on a curated aesthetic to mask his severe operational deficits. He utilized imported sedans, luxury country club memberships, and an arrogant demeanor to project an illusion of unassailable success. He believed the world accepted his venture capitalist facade without demanding to inspect the underlying ledger. Discovering that the family patriarch had not only suspected his fraud, but had actively engineered a federal sting operation, short-circuited his cognitive pathways. He possessed no rehearsed script for this specific scenario. The charming, entitled heir was dead, replaced by a cornered fraudster, staring at the blueprints of his own cage. I did not offer a comforting gesture. A cybersecurity incident commander does not soothe a hostile actor after neutralizing their breach. I required the presentation of my own distinct intelligence-gathering efforts to finalize the containment protocol. The federal proffer agreement detailed the overarching jurisdiction, but my shadow audit provided the granular, irrefutable mechanics of his specific theft. I reached into my structured leather tote bag. My fingers bypassed my encrypted laptop and located the smooth, matte surface of my black presentation folder. I extracted the dossier. It was a modern, streamlined counterpart to Henry's heavy canvas portfolio containing the digital exhaust Marcus had carelessly generated over the past 18 months. I stepped toward the mahogany desk. I lifted the black folder a few inches above the polished wood and released my grip. The loud, definitive slap of the rigid cover hitting the surface echoed through the study, functioning as a secondary gavel strike. The sharp acoustic crack forced Marcus to break his paralyzed stare. He flinched, his eyes darting from the federal business card to my newly deposited ledger. Grandpa Henry documented the origin of the extracted funds, I stated, my voice resuming its steady clinical cadence. He provided the sworn testimony required to establish the initial intent of the embezzlement. However, an effective prosecution requires a precise map of the laundering process. The Bureau needs to trace the flow of the flagged capital through your commercial architecture. I opened the black presentation folder. The crisp, white pages inside contained the results of my rigorous, silent investigation. I did not invite him to read the text. I delivered the summary directly, translating the complex data points into undeniable facts. The $400,000 you siphoned from his primary investment accounts did not vanish into a generic savings vault. I explained, sorting through the printed spreadsheets. You routed the capital into a holding company registered under your venture firm. You assumed utilizing a corporate shell provided a layer of impenetrable insulation. You failed to realize that shell corporations cast distinct digital shadows. I extracted a page detailing the offshore routing numbers and the subsequent domestic transfers. My audit proves your enterprise is a highly structured Ponzi scheme, Marcus. You utilized Henry's retirement capital to pay dividends to your restless early investors, desperately attempting to mask your profound insolvency. You injected federally flagged funds directly into the central plumbing of your fraudulent operation, thereby contaminating your entire financial ecosystem. The hyperventilating gasps escaping his throat grew louder, echoing in the confined space of the study. He reached a trembling hand toward the edge of the desk, seeking a physical anchor to prevent his collapse. But the corruption was not isolated to your individual actions, I continued, retrieving the final, most damning artifact from my dossier. A systemic failure of this magnitude often requires a dedicated enabler to maintain the illusion of legitimacy. I placed a fabricated, backdated document onto the center of the desk. The heading read, "Promissory Note." It was the exact paperwork our mother had attempted to force upon me in Boston. Elaine arrived at my apartment 2 days ago. I revealed, watching the residual color drain from his neck and jawline. She operated as your unwitting accomplice, deployed to apply preemptive pressure. She presented this specific instrument, demanding I sign it as a witness. She wanted me to legitimize the theft, to categorize the stolen federal funds as a pre-death business loan authorized by Henry to support your struggling firm. Marcus stared at the forged document. He recognized his own desperate handiwork. She explicitly prioritized your fabricated success over the truth. I stated, my tone unyielding. She admitted she knew your business was failing, yet she demanded I absorb the criminal liability to protect your social standing. My partner Liam intercepted the coercion. He secured the perimeter and expelled her from the premises. But her attempt yielded a crucial deliverable. She handed me the documented proof of her own parental complicity. The enabling structure that sustained your arrogance is now a matter of formal record. The verified data was fully deployed. The architecture of his ruin was laid bare, illuminated by the harsh light of undeniable facts. He was exposed as an embezzler, a manipulator, and the primary target of an active federal investigation. The safety net woven by our mother was shredded. The inheritance he sought to steal was a mirage designed to facilitate his capture. I looked directly into his wide, panicked eyes. The arrogant venture capitalist was gone. He did not trust you, Marcus, I stated, delivering the final assessment with cold, surgical precision. He audited you, and he left the final delivery to me. The psychological dam broke. The overwhelming weight of the verified intelligence crushed his remaining defenses. Marcus threw his head back and released a raw, hysterical scream. It was a guttural sound of total, unadulterated defeat, a primal noise stripped of all refined country club aesthetics. The shriek echoed off the oak paneling, vibrating with the sheer terror of a man recognizing the permanent termination of his freedom. At that exact moment, the external environment responded to the internal collapse. A sudden, rhythmic sweep of brilliant light pierced the frosted glass of the study windows. Brilliant flashes of alternating red and blue cut through the darkness of the surrounding estate, projecting rapid, sweeping shadows across the walls of the room. The intense, rotating illumination washed over the antique bookshelves, the mahogany desk, and the pale, terrified face of my brother. The heavy crunch of thick, all-terrain tires rolling over the crushed stone driveway signaled the arrival of multiple heavy vehicles. The low, rumbling hum of powerful engines filled the coastal air, overpowering the mechanical whine of the abandoned drill resting on the floor. The timeline had reached its ultimate convergence. Prior to initiating the physical infiltration of the property, I had contacted the specific field office listed on the federal business card. I provided the designated agents with the operational schedule, the cloned access codes to the main security gates, and the precise coordinates of the evidentiary vault. I informed them that the primary suspect was currently en route to the location, driven by a desperate need to secure the assets. They did not require a warrant to enter the perimeter. The legal heir and current authorized administrator of the estate had formally invited them onto the grounds. The rhythmic flashing of the emergency lights intensified, painting the study in harsh, relentless colors. The crackle of a police radio drifted through the front corridors of the house. The sound of heavy vehicle doors slamming shut echoed from the front courtyard. The authoritative crunch of tactical boots marching across the frozen gravel announced the final transition of power. Grandpa Henry's designated field agents had arrived to collect their deliverables. The affluent, untouchable facade of the Golden Child was permanently obliterated, replaced by the stark, undeniable reality of a federal arrest. The trap was shut, the ledger was balanced, and the incident response was proceeding exactly according to the calculated metrics. The federal agents moved with practiced, synchronized efficiency. They did not shout or draw their weapons. The atmosphere in the study required no physical escalation. The presentation of my shadow ledger, combined with the signed proffer agreement secured inside the vault, provided all the necessary probable cause. The lead investigator stepped forward, pulling a pair of standard steel restraints from his belt. He instructed my brother to turn around and place his hands behind his back. Marcus did not resist. The arrogant venture capitalist who had burst through the mahogany doors mere minutes prior dissolved into a hollow, trembling shell. He lacked the capacity to process the sudden, catastrophic failure of his curated reality. The metallic click of the handcuffs closing around his wrists produced a sharp, resonant sound in the quiet study. It was a sterile, mechanical noise echoing the finality of a system shutting down. The agents gathered the index dossier and the federal documentation securing the chain of custody. They escorted Marcus out the front door, guiding him down the icy porch steps he had climbed with such aggressive certainty earlier that evening. The flashing red and blue emergency lights painted his pale, terrified face as they placed him into the back of a government transport vehicle. He was stripped of his bespoke tailoring and his country club title, reduced to a designated suspect in a sweeping financial crimes investigation. Elaine remained anchored to the floral wallpaper in the hallway. Her hands hovered near her mouth, her eyes wide with a horrifying realization. The golden child she had subsidized, protected, and prioritized was currently sitting in the back of a federal cruiser. The illusion of her upward mobility evaporated into the freezing coastal air. She looked toward me, her gaze desperate, seeking a familiar administrative rescue. She expected the incident commander to step in to negotiate with the authorities, to offer a quiet financial bailout to make the problem disappear. I offered 0 comforting words. I did not step forward to manage the crisis. The time for silent subsidies had expired. I simply gathered my black presentation folder, secured it inside my leather tote bag, and walked past her. I exited the breached perimeter without looking back, leaving the enabler to navigate the wreckage of the collision she had helped engineer. In the ensuing weeks, the institutional machinery of the Justice Department operated with relentless velocity. Marcus faced a grand jury indictment for multiple counts of federal wire fraud, elder financial exploitation, and forgery. The evidence I compiled during my shadow audit provided an inescapable prosecutable framework. The routing numbers, the dummy corporations, and the traced Internet Protocol addresses left his defense attorneys with 0 viable leverage. He accepted a plea arrangement to avoid a protracted public trial, guaranteeing a lengthy residency within a federal correctional facility. The local intelligence network operated with equal speed. The extended Massachusetts relatives, who had eagerly absorbed Marcus's smear campaign at the country club luncheon, received the verified data. Federal indictments are matters of public record. The aunts and cousins who had pitied my brother and condemned my supposed greed now scrambled to distance themselves from a radioactive liability. Elaine faced a profound, unyielding social exile. She attempted to maintain her routine, showing up for her scheduled charity committee meetings and holiday brunches, pretending the arrest was a minor misunderstanding. The community rejected her narrative. Her phone calls went unanswered. Her invitations were declined. The affluent peers she prioritized over her own daughter recognized the toxic nature of her complicity and revoked her access to their network. She was isolated, forced to endure the consequences of her misplaced loyalty without a designated shock absorber to cushion the fall. The poetic justice of the situation manifested with mathematical perfection. Marcus had utilized the embezzled federal funds to sustain his affluent lifestyle, projecting an aura of immense wealth to lure in new investors for his Ponzi scheme. The authorities initiated immediate asset forfeiture protocols to recover the stolen capital. They targeted the luxury downtown Boston condominium he used as a primary prop for his social media performance. Federal agents arrived at the building with a sweeping court order. They seized the property, confiscating his imported vehicles, his designer watches, and his high-end furnishings. Then they executed a maneuver of flawless, symmetrical justice. They deactivated his digital access fobs and swapped the physical locks on his front door. Marcus had initiated this entire conflict by changing the security codes on our grandfather's estate, attempting to hoard a legacy that did not belong to him. He believed that controlling the perimeter granted him ownership. Now he was permanently locked out of his own life, stripped of his credentials, and forced to reside in a concrete cell. The probate courts eventually reviewed the true, unredacted directives Grandpa Henry had stored inside the steel floor safe. The legal instructions were explicit and airtight. Henry left the entirety of his clean, unencumbered assets and the historic Cape Cod estate directly to me. He recognized that I was the only descendant capable of managing the portfolio without succumbing to greed or manipulation. I did not move into the Victorian house. Holding on to a physical structure saturated with decades of uneven family dynamics yields a negative return on investment. The property represented a closed chapter, a server that no longer required active maintenance. I contracted a reputable real estate firm to list the estate on the commercial market. The transaction closed within 60 days. I liquidated the property, converting the brick and mortar into secure, compounding capital. By selling the house, I permanently severed my remaining financial and geographical ties to my mother and the corrupted network she fostered. I returned to my organized life in Boston. The drive back to the city alongside Liam proceeded in a comfortable, resonant quiet. We did not discuss the theatrical panic my brother displayed during his arrest or the frantic enabling pleas of my mother. A finalized audit requires no further review. We parked our vehicle in the subterranean garage and carried our bags up to our apartment. Liam inserted his key into the door. The heavy, satisfying click of the deadbolt engaging echoed in the quiet hallway. We stepped inside, securing our own perimeter. The environment was warm, regulated, and immune to external emotional manipulation. I placed my leather tote bag onto the entryway console, feeling the profound weightlessness of a balanced ledger. I returned to my career as a cybersecurity incident commander the following Monday. I sat at my desk, monitoring global digital perimeters, analyzing data streams, and neutralizing hostile intrusions before they could compromise the structural integrity of my clients. The experience with my grandfather's safe reinforced a foundational truth governing both software architecture and human relationships. Many individuals operate under the flawed premise that familial duty requires the continuous absorption of toxic behavior. They believe harmony is achieved by silently paying the deficits and fixing the logistical errors of unreasonable relatives. A seasoned security professional knows this is a dangerous fallacy. You cannot patch a network that is fundamentally designed to leak. True peace does not manifest from quietly absorbing the consequences of someone else's vanity. True peace comes from trusting the verified data. It requires the discipline to inspect the ledger without sentimentality, to recognize when an investment is bankrupt, and to permanently delete corrupted users from the network.